Hey, One Life Church. It is so good to hang out with you today. My name is Justin, one of the pastors here, and today I'm finishing up our series called Kingdom Generosity. I want to invite you to go ahead and turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 12, and you're going to want to do that. So if you need to grab your phone and use the Bible app, or if you want to grab a Bible and turn to Mark chapter 12, you're going to want to be there so that you can follow along as we study a couple different stories between Mark 12 and Mark 14. While you're turning there, let me remind you that in this series, at the beginning of this series in week 1, I defined generosity as us helping other people. And so when we are generous, when we practice radical generosity, we are helping the people around us. We're helping other humans around us. And so that's a very basic, practical way to define and think about kingdom generosity, is we are looking for places where God is at work, where we can join him, where we can be a blessing to the people around us, where we can help other people. So keep that in your mind as we finish out this series on kingdom generosity. Here's where I want to begin. I want to begin with a story. In week number 1, I told a story about my grandma, Gill, Louise Gill, which is my mom's mom, and about her radical generosity and how that affected my life. Today, I want to tell a story about my grandma Wallace, which is my dad's grandma, Janetti Wallace. And I was thinking about this story because over the past couple weeks, my grandma has been very sick. She's in her 90s. She's been in the hospital, but thank God she has now moved out of the hospital into a rehab facility. She is a strong, strong woman. So, but this story came to my mind as I've been just, checking in on her and hearing how she's been doing the last couple weeks. She grew up in a really, really tough family. She was one of several kids, over a dozen kids, and her parents really weren't interested in raising her. This is how the story goes, at least. And so at some point, they actually moved my grandma to be with one of her sisters who was quite a bit older. And so she moved from central Indiana up to Chicago with one of her sisters. And she was very young, not even a teenager at this point. And she had to get a job in a local pub just to make some money for her sister, to make some money for the household. And so here she is already as a young girl grinding, and life wasn't exactly really easy for my grandma growing up. And family was not the way that family is supposed to be for her. And so here she is growing up as a young girl, and she tells the story that as she's walking through this experience, as she's experiencing what we call a family system, a very toxic and dysfunctional family system, as she's being moved from one house to the other house, as she's being looked over, she says that she told God, if you would give me a family, I will do it differently. If you'll just give me a family, I will do it in a different way. Now, what's amazing is you fast forward, 80 years, and you look at the family system that she has created. It's not perfect by any means, but what's incredible is that the perseverance and the faithfulness of this woman, of this dream that she had to shift the system, has actually taken place. That she was able to have this dream of a different way of doing things, and that's exactly what she did. She passed on a new vision. She passed on new values. She shifted the system. Today, as we look at some stories from Mark chapter 12, Mark chapter 13, and Mark chapter 14, what we're going to see is that Jesus actually shifts a system. That Jesus finds himself in a cultural, contextual system that is toxic and unhealthy, and Jesus came to shift that system to look more like his kingdom. So let's take a look at these stories. We're going to look at start in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 38. And it says this, As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." So here's Jesus sitting in the temple with some of his followers, and he's telling them, watch out, beware of the teachers of the law. And he says, these people, they want the best seats in the synagogues. They want the places of honor. And then he says, they devour widows' houses. This is not just their dwelling place, but their livelihood, the way that they were able to live in the world. They devour widows, and for a show, they make lengthy prayers. And he says, these men will be punished most severely. Then he goes on. In verse 41, it says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. So here they are sitting in the temple, and he's sitting and he's watching people come in and make their offerings. And it says, many rich people, they threw in large amounts, but there was a poor widow, came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They, the rich, they gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all that she had to live on. Now what's happening here? What's going on in this scene, in this story of Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44? I need to start by making a confession. I've always taught this text, especially the story about the widow and her 2 copper coins. I've always taught this text in a way that points to and celebrates the widow's incredible generosity. But this week, as I was studying this story, even in the 11th hour before I recorded this sermon, God completely blew my mind. And he gave me a new lens to see this story through. By reading commentaries, by studying this story, by having some conversations about it, God gave me a new lens to see this story. Let me say this right up front. What I'm about to share with you is I am not saying that this widow in Mark chapter 12 was not generous. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm asking is why? Why was this poor widow giving what Jesus said was more than all of the others, than all of the rich who were also giving? Why is that? So here's the context. They're in the temple, in the place where the people would come and worship God, where godly people like this widow would come to worship God. It was the dwelling place of God's presence, the center of communal activity. It was the place where people who loved God would come to worship and make their sacrifices for the forgiveness of their sin and to receive God's blessing. So it was a different system than we have for the most part today. They would come to the temple, they would pay their offering or their tithe, they would receive forgiveness for their sins, they would experience the presence of God, and they would receive a blessing. At this time, you had to literally make a payment in order to worship God. You had to buy a dove or a pigeon or a lamb in order to make a sacrifice to fulfill the law of the Old Testament, to fulfill the sacrifices of the Old Testament. You had to give a tithe based on your income in order to enter the temple so that you could worship God. So, this widow is a godly woman, a God-fearing woman, a Yahweh-fearing woman. She loves God. And she comes to the temple, and the teachers of the law, the gatekeepers, They have driven up the price of admission. But she's willing. She's willing to give what she has so that she can experience God, so that she can worship God. Is she radically generous? Maybe. We're not sure. But what we do know is that this woman is caught in the trap of an oppressive system that Jesus says is devouring widows' houses, that is devouring widows' livelihoods. Now, you might argue that Jesus celebrates how much she gave at the end of the story. After all, Jesus had said that she gave more than even the rich had given. But let's rethink Jesus' statement through the lens of the system that the widow finds herself in. Reading the story through this lens, it doesn't seem like Jesus is lifting up the widow as an example to follow. God, forgive me for the many times that I have used this story to that end. Jesus never says, follow her example. Instead, what Jesus is doing is that he is condemning the system that is using religiosity, using connection with God as a way to force people to be generous. The system that this widow finds herself in is using God's presence as a product, a good to be purchased. And the widow who loves God will do whatever is required to worship God and connect with God. And so she gives her 2 copper coins. Shame on the system. Shame on the system. Now let's see what Jesus does. We turn the page to Mark chapter 13. Remember, chapter headings, all those things, verses, they don't exist in the original manuscript, okay? Mark is just writing a letter outlining the life and the ministry and the teachings of Jesus. So it continues. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." So he's looking around at the city of God. He's looking around at the temple, and he says, "Look how amazing this is." Another way you could say this is, look at this system that we have created with our own hands. And Jesus replies, "Do you see all of these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." Wow. Wow. Jesus throws down. Jesus says this system is going to fall. This system that you just saw at work with the widow, this system is going to fall. And let's take note of something in the character of God as revealed in the person of Jesus in Mark chapter 13. God will tear down oppressive systems. God will tear down oppressive systems. Why? Because God cares about people. Because God is concerned about freedom, as Paul writes in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. It is for freedom that we have been set free. Because God hates injustice. Because God loves justice. Because God is a God of justice. Now you might ask, where's the grace in this? Well, let's think about the widow in Mark chapter 12. Isn't it grace upon grace for her? When Jesus says that he has come to topple the oppressive system that keeps her from connecting with God freely? Isn't that grace? Isn't that amazing grace? It might not seem like grace for the rich and the powerful. It might not seem like grace for the gatekeeper, but it is grace for the marginalized. And I would even argue that it's also grace for the rich and the powerful. It's grace for the gatekeeper. Because the reality is that God did not create them to be oppressors. They were created, just like all of us, to live in connection with their God and in community with their fellow image bearers. And they are drowning when we are the oppressors. Anytime we as human beings put our thumb on someone else, we are drowning in our sinfulness. They are drowning in their sinfulness. And Jesus doesn't give up on them. Instead, Jesus is inviting them to walk into a new life that promotes freedom rather than walking in the ways of death that leads to injustice and oppression. My goodness, God is radically generous. I've been noticing how much time Jesus spent with the teachers of the law throughout the Gospels. How much time he spent with the Pharisees and the presumed religious gatekeepers. It's so annoying, in my opinion. Why was he wasting his time with these scumbags? Here's why. Because God is radically generous. God is radically generous to all of us. Remember, these teachers of the law, these Pharisees, these religious gatekeepers, they are Israelites. They are part of God's chosen people, and they have lost their way. They've gotten off the path big time, but God doesn't give up on them. Jesus keeps inviting them. Why? Because God is radically generous, giving himself, inviting us into relationship with him. All right, let's move on. Because there's an example of radical generosity coming right around the corner. Let's look at Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away from when they were in the temple, and he saw what was happening to the widow. We're 2 days away from the Passover. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law, they were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. And but they said, not during the festival, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and she poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, 'Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor.' And they rebuked her harshly. But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime that you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.'" There is so much happening in this room. Jesus is at the home of Simon the leper. They're having a meal together. Jesus had healed Simon the leper. His story was most likely recorded in Mark chapter 1. Full circle. He's eating with Simon the leper. They're having a meal when a woman approaches Jesus. Who was this woman? Carrie, one of our staff members here, she shared some amazing facts with me about this woman found in Mark chapter 14 and about this encounter that she has with Jesus. Carrie shared with me that many people think that the woman that anointed Jesus in Luke 6 and the woman that anointed Jesus in Mark 14 were the same woman, but they weren't. The woman that anointed Jesus in Mark 14 in this story was Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Do you remember who Lazarus was? The friend of Jesus who had died, they had buried. Jesus comes and raises Lazarus from the dead. And so Mary most likely anoints Jesus as a way to say thank you for what Jesus had done for her brother. It may have cost her entire savings, and it may have been something that she would have used to go back and anoint her dead brother's body if Jesus had not raised him from the dead. Now, there were some haters in the room. And they raised some concern, and their language is a reflection of the system. They said, we could have sold this perfume and done something really, really holy with it. Imagine what we could have done. We could have pleased God with it. We could have used it for sacrifice. What their language is it's religiosity doused in self-righteous acts. And Jesus isn't amused. Jesus has come to topple the oppressive system and create a new system, a new way of living. So Jesus makes a statement. He says, what Mary has done for me is a beautiful thing, or an eternal thing, a heavenly thing. What has she done? Well, the perfume that she has poured all over Jesus' head and feet was a perfume known as spikenard. It's incredibly pungent, and she poured a whole pound of this perfume on him. Everyone would have smelled Jesus like a middle school boy that forgot his deodorant. Everyone would have smelled Jesus. Not just in the room, but actually for days to come. It's like when your grandpa puts too much Old Spice on. Just lingers with you for days, right? She is making a statement with this perfume. She is saying that Jesus is the Messiah, which in the Hebrew language means the anointed one. She is using the perfume as a sermon illustration. She's shining a spotlight on Jesus and saying to the world, this is the anointed one. This is the Messiah. Now, the next day was the triumphal entry. Jesus would have been absolutely reeking of this perfume. The combination of walking through the crowds and them fanning him with the palm branches would have made the area smell very strongly. It would have turned heads. People would have noticed. This perfume that she used was one of the oils that was used to anoint kings. In the ancient Middle East, the majesty of a king was expressed not only by what he wore, but by his royal aroma. This way, when the king would pass by, the fragrance would inform the crowds that the king has arrived. Mary is making a statement. The King of heaven has arrived. This is one of the reasons why the Pharisees were so angry. Because the fragrance that followed Jesus was proclaiming that he was in fact king, that he was the Messiah, that he was the anointed one, the one that the prophets said would come. And Jesus was nothing like they expected. He was poor. He was from the wrong part of town. He didn't snuggle up with the gatekeepers. He didn't prop up their system. He hung out with all the wrong people. The aroma from the perfume would have lingered the entire week, all the way through the Holy Week, the final week of Jesus' life. When he was arguing with them in the temple, when they arrested him, when they cast lots for his garment, every single step of the way, Mary's gift reminded those who were doing such a grave injustice that they were doing it to the King of Kings. I mean, imagine for a moment the Garden of Gethsemane as the guards came to arrest Jesus, and the guards would have caught a sniff of this strong fragrance. It would have been a punch right in the nose. All of the Old Testament passages about fragrance of the coming king would have flooded their noses and their minds and their hearts. Wow. Look at what Mary has done. She has anointed the King of Kings, the Messiah. Now hold on. There's more happening here. Did you notice where she anoints Jesus? Did you notice where she worships God in flesh? Did you notice where she proclaims that Jesus is king? It's in a home. She worships Jesus in a home, not in a temple. Now, I'm not sure that she knew this or not, but there's a powerful message here. The message is that God is not confined to a temple. God is no longer kept behind the doors of the oppressive system where you have to pay in order to worship him and connect with him, but instead God is with us in our homes, in our everyday lives. There's a massive shift, a systematic shift happening here. The widow was required to pay to worship God. And now, in Jesus' kingdom, in the system that Jesus was setting up, Mary is able to worship God freely, and her generosity is not forced or required. Rather, her generosity is an overflow. Her generosity is an overflow from her encounter with a radically generous God. All right, I got to land this plane. The final thing that Jesus says in this story is that her story will be told for generations. That every time that the gospel is proclaimed, her story will be told. This is what I would like to call the legacy of generosity. See, true, pure, beautiful, and willing generosity, it carries on for generations. The stories of radical kingdom generosity are told from generation to generation to generation. We carry them with us. They follow us around like a fragrance, like an aroma. Listen what the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. He says, in the Messiah, God leads us from place to place, one perpetual victory parade. Through us, he brings knowledge of Christ. Everywhere we go, listen to this, people breathe in the exquisite fragrance. Because of Christ, we give off a sweet scent rising to God, an aroma of life. We, as we place our faith in Jesus, as we surrender our lives to Jesus, as we experience the radical generosity of God, we have experienced the life-changing aroma of the Anointed One. Now we carry that aroma with us into our everyday lives. And it rubs off on the people around us in the world that we find ourselves in. And it rubs off on the generations that follow us. I want to get really practical here. And I want to talk about financial generosity as we finish our time together. You know, as a kid growing up in the church, I caught radical generosity. I wasn't just taught financial generosity in the church, I caught it. The way that this happened was every single Sunday, as the offering plate was passed around, as it was passed down my row, and I sat by my mom and dad, every Sunday I would look over, and after communion, I would watch my mom take out her checkbook and write her tithe check. And as the offering plate passed her, I would watch her put that check as an offering, as a way of, as a symbol of radical generosity into that offering plate. My parents were telling a story with their actions, passing on the practice of radical generosity to the next generation. Now, Nicole and I, we are doing our best to pass this on, but the reality is that we don't write checks on Sundays. All of our financial generosity happens online, so our kids never see it. So how do we teach them? Well, we have this practice in our house where we use 3 cups with our kids. And we've given each one of our kids 3 cups, and one of those cups has the word spend on it. And our kids make a little bit of money doing some things around the house, and, not a lot, but they do make some money. And so they have a cup that has the word spend on it. And then they have a cup that says the word save on it. And then they have a cup that has the word give. And so each time that our kids make a little bit of money, we help them take that money and break it down and put some money in their spend cup, things that they can spend it on, whether it's candy at a baseball game or a video game, whatever it is, they have the choice to spend their money in the ways they want to spend it. They have a cup that says save. We're talking to them about saving their money for things that are to come in the years to come. And then they have a cup that says give. And we have taught them and we're showing them, just like my mom showed me, that whenever you make money, there's a portion of that you are generous with that money. There have been times they've used that money to do something for the blessing box here at the church. There have been times whenever they have given that money here at church as an offering. But just like my parents taught me from generation to generation, we are also teaching our kids. We want to pass it on, just like Jesus celebrated in Mary, that this will be told for generations to come. We want the practice of generosity to be taught from generation to generation. So how are you going to pass on the kingdom practice of generosity? How are you going to do that? How are you going to leave a legacy of generosity? One of the ways that you can start to do this is by setting out your guiding principles for your finances. So the reality is that a lot of us, even as Christians, we are not very generous with our finances. My friend Ben says, if you want to know how generous you are, look at your calendar and look at your bank account. And the reality is that most of us don't have generosity as a guiding principle when it comes to our finances. So what I want to encourage you to do this week is I want to encourage you to find a napkin, and I want you to write on that napkin your financial guiding principles. Financial guiding principles. There it is. I don't know if you can read that or not. And I want you, if you're married, if you're not married, find some friends. If you have kids, I want you to sit down and I want you to write out, what do you want your money to do? And listen, we're not living according to the oppressive system that tells you what you have to do with your money. You have a choice. But you need to write it down and allow these guiding principles to point you in the right direction. And so it might be things like, one of the things you need to put on there for sure is paying your bills. That's a big one. That's a guiding principle. We want to pay our bills, pay our mortgage, pay our car payments, whatever those things are. That's a guiding principle. A guiding principle might be that your family loves to go on vacations. That could be a guiding principle. For our family, memories. with our family, with our kids, is a guiding principle. We want our money to help us make memories with our kids. And one of our guiding principles is generosity. Financial generosity to the church, a partnership with the church, but also in the world where we find ourselves. And so we come back to these guiding principles, and they help us live in line with the system that Jesus has created. We come back to these guiding principles, and they help us pass on the practice of generosity to the generations that follow us. One Life Church, my prayer for you is this: that you will live in the new system of Mary. Free to be radically generous in everything that you do. And that you will pass this practice of radical generosity on to the people around you and on to the generations that follow you. My prayer is that our church will be marked by radical generosity. And so I want to encourage you to get practical, to live in this new system that Jesus set up for you. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt or shame or fear, rather from a place of freedom, as an overflow. As an overflow from your experience with God, a radically generous God, from sitting in the presence of Jesus. That's what changed Mary's life. She sat in the presence of a radically generous God whose name was Jesus. And it transformed her life in such a way that she herself was radically generous. I pray that you will have that same experience with the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Christ. Let's take communion together and let's sit in the presence of Jesus. Let's sit in the presence of the Anointed One and ask that he would breathe all over us, that his aroma would fill us up, that it would be contagious, that it would cover us, that we would continue to be transformed into his likeness. If you have the elements, go ahead and hold the bread in one hand and hold the cup in the other. And let's celebrate and let's proclaim the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus as our only hope. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he sat with some of his closest friends. And they had a meal together. And during that meal, Jesus took the bread and he gave thanks for the bread. And then he broke it. And he said to his friends, "This bread is my body, broken for you, given to you. Take and eat." In the same way, he took the cup. He gave thanks for the cup. And then he said to his friends, "This is an invitation to be in relationship with me, to sit with me. This is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Take and drink." I'd like to read the benediction over us as we continue to worship and as we head into a time of singing. If you would, just extend your hands. This comes from 2 Corinthians. In the Messiah, God leads us from place to place in one perpetual victory parade. Through us, he brings knowledge of Christ. Everywhere we go, people breathe in the exquisite fragrance. Because of Christ, we give off a sweet scent rising to God, an aroma of life. Amen.